Thank you, Elizabeth. I was a curious child. Not that I mean I was in any way odd, rather I was imbued with curiosity. I recall how shortly after entering my teens, I found the words in a vault near this place on a mural monument, quite something which excited curiosity over its meaning than the sculptural importance of the monument itself. In truth, I could never get excited over early monuments. I didn't like the battered and damaged effigies of medieval knights. Rather, I preferred the grandiose, almost theatrical creations of Roubiliac and Rysbrack, and the elegance of John Bacon, Nollekins and Wilton, though I must confess that I found the monuments of John Flaxman somewhat insipid. I often wondered what was a vault, and how did it relate to the monument or the Ledgerstone, and what did it look like? However, those childhood musings remained on the back burner until 1968, when the floor of a church in Essex gave way beneath my feet and plunged me into the realms of the dead. One does one of two things having fallen into a vault. The first is to get out twice as fast as one fell in. The second is to have a good look round and see what is on offer. I stayed and I looked. It was indeed a Howard Carter moment. What I did not know then was that the subject of burial vaults and their contents had just found the author they had been seeking, and I have never looked back. That there is an identifiable architecture of death cannot be denied. It is to be seen in countless town and country churches, more especially in the dynastic burial vaults of the aristocracy and landed gentry. Dark, dismal chambers, the gloom pierced by the occasional shaft of light filtering through partially blocked ventilation grills, and whose damp walls, musty atmosphere, and crumbling coffins display the full and dreadful panoply of items manufactured by the living for the twilight world of the dead. Be that as it may, it is to be regretted that few architectural historians have commented on burial vaults, their publications dwelling more on the outward and visible above-ground structures, making no mention whatsoever of what lies beneath. No architectural historian can be worth his or her salt if they have not seen the burial chamber beneath Hawksmoor's mausoleum at Castle Howard, that which you're looking at now. It is a tomb to die for, the quintessence of sepulchral grandeur. The raison d'etre for the dynastic burial vault in early modern England was explained by the antiquary John Weaver in 1631. He said, "It was usual in ancient times, and so it is in these our days, for persons of especial rank and quality to make their own tombs and monuments in their lifetime, partly for that they may have a certain house, whensoever they should be taken away by death out of their tenement, and partly to please themselves in beholding their dead countenance in marble, but most especially because they thought to preserve their memories from oblivion." It may well be, of course, that Weaver had been contemplating Psalm 49 and its various salutary verses, such as, "There be some that put their trust in goods and boast themselves in the multitude of their riches, and yet they think that their houses shall continue forever, and that their dwelling place shall endure from generation to generation, and call the lands after their own names. Their beauty shall consume in the sepulchre out of their dwelling, for he shall carry nothing away with him when he dieth, and neither shall his pomp follow him." The construction of the dynastic burial vaults, especially those associated with the state churches, flew in the face of the psalmist. These subterranean chambers were expressions of riches. Many were associated with the estates which had indeed been named after their owners. Most believed that the vault would safeguard their remains inviolate until the day of resurrection, and they did indeed trust that their sepulchral monument would reflect their status in the world, however small that world might have been, as with the pomp associated with the format of the obsequies. To generalize, there was much activity during the 17th century amongst the landed gentry and wealthy merchant classes in providing burial vaults for themselves and their progeny, usually taking the form of a small mortuary chapel within their parish church, rather to spend out on a grand official sepulchral monument. To a greater extent, they were taking advantage of the current political situation, providing for themselves that which had beforehand been seen as the sole reserve of the aristocracy. Similarly, the brick grave with the Ledgerstone became established as the accepted mode of burial for the middling sort towards the end of the 17th century, an approach which reflected the inward and spiritual attitude of the time rather than the outward and visible display favoured in a previous age. With the restoration of the monarchy, vaults and their associated monuments were regarded with equal importance, though by the early 18th century, greater attention was being directed towards the interior arrangements of the burial vault itself, outweighing such considerations as the funerary monument. However, here was ample provision for both, with the advent of the landscape mausoleum and, in a few instances, the churchyard mausoleum. Most of the 13,000 churches of medieval foundation contained burial vaults of one sort or another, and about 20% of that number has purpose-built mortuary aisles or chapels. For the purpose of this paper, the majority of the examples I will be showing have been drawn from the counties of Essex and Somerset, counties similar in size but with different populations, Essex being for the London-based parvenu merchant class and Somerset for the established aristocracy. Following the Reformation, there was little attempt on the part of the newly established Anglican Church to put an end to the old system of intramural burial. Rather, as the clergy derived their incomes from fees, pew rents, tithes, and occasional services, interment within churches was seen as a lucrative, though not reliable, event. Again, there was no specific guidance as to the fee payable to the incumbent for the privilege of intramural burial. And as the land beneath the church floor was considered to be part of the incumbent's freehold, he could, and often did, ask of the petitioner that which he thought to be fit. An examination of the few incumbents' accounts which survive show that the mid-17th century fee was usually 5 guineas, the equivalent of £5,000 by today's standards. Add to this the cost of excavating the floor for the grave, lining it with brick, and providing an inscribed Ledgerstone, and one would soon find that £25, 25,000 by today's standards, had soon been expended. Indeed, costs remained the same over the succeeding centuries. A single-width brick grave for 3 coffins on the Centre Avenue at London's Kensal Green Cemetery currently sells for £50,000 exclusive of the monument. Thus, intramural burial in the 17th and 18th centuries bolstered the incumbent's income considerably, whilst at the same time affording to the purchaser a quality of social status, albeit post-mortem. It was not unusual for those on the fringe of respectability to save for the acquisition of intramural burial. This was certainly the case at Thaxted, Essex, where there are early 18th century brick graves with Ledgerstones to a miller, a butcher, and at the west end of the nave at St. Peter's, Little Walsingham, Norfolk, can be found a Ledgerstone capping off the brick grave of a former landlord of the Black Lion of Little Walsingham. Some individuals managed to bypass paying a fee to the incumbent. For example, if there was a lay rectorate annexed to the freehold of the manor, the squire could exercise his prerogative to create a vault of any dimension within the chancel without having to pay any fees, and neither did he require the incumbent's permission to do so. The Smiths of Thaden Mount in Essex, for example, had far more sway. Throughout the 18th century, they were squarsons, which is to say vicar patrons. 3 successive Smith baronets were ordained, and each presented himself to his own living. Consequently, this small church became their mausoleum, and the space beneath the chancel their vault, and with no fees to pay whatsoever. Total bliss. Such manorial rights were sold on whenever the manor changed hands. In 1837, Sir John Boileau of Tackle-Neston purchased Ketteringham Hall, Norfolk. In 1853, he decided to empty the Heron vault beneath the chancel for the sake of his own family, having sought a faculty so to do. Unfortunately for Boileau, a distant cousin of the Herons demanded the reinstatement of the coffins, and the bishop had no alternative than to rescind the faculty granted to Sir John, as a result of which Boileau was forced to erect a mausoleum in the churchyard and abandon all ideas of intramural burial within the church building itself. The hallmark for the successful 17th century merchant or lawyer was the acquisition of a small, compact country manor. With this came status, patrimony, and the advowson of the parish church. And indeed, this system ran throughout the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries and continues to the present day, though it tends more to be associated with hedge fund managers seeking early retirement than with wealthy London shopkeepers and tradesmen. Be that as it may, the nouveau riche of the 17th and 18th centuries looked for something more to set down as an indication of their social status. Not for them an additional house in Barbados, nor a Ferrari in the garage. Rather, they preferred the establishment of a burial vault within or attached to the parish church, a dynastic mortuary chamber into which could be herded the encoffined remains of successive generations of the family until the last trump. On a smaller scale, the brick grave was the preferred mode for intramural burial within town churches during the late 17th and early 18th centuries, due to the demand of the middling sort, who, affronted by the number of headstones to those of the artisan class appearing in the churchyards, moved indoors, where it was more expensive and therefore exclusive to be buried. To give you a flavour of how densely utilised these churches became, let me direct you to St Augustine the Less, Bristol. Here you can see the site prior to its excavation in 1983. But remove the topsoil and you'll see what I mean by densely utilised. Be that as it may, the burial vault craze was a short-lived phenomenon, popular between the last quarter of the 16th and the third quarter of the 18th centuries, after which the brick grave took precedence. It is not unusual for a family to own more than one freehold vault within a single building. The Cavendishes have 2 in what is now Derby Cathedral, as do the Brands at Thaxted in Essex. The Chiswells have 3 at Debden, Essex. However, it was more generally accepted that additional space could be achieved by extending the original vault, as did the Hazelriggs at Knowsley in Leicestershire and the Barnardistons at Kedleston in Suffolk. Most mural monuments contain a clue as to where the vault is situated, but this cannot always be trusted. The directive, in a vault near this place, more likely refers to a brick grave with a Ledgerstone. Admittedly, such harmless pretension was more common in the 18th century. However, there was, and indeed there is, no compunction in ecclesiastical law for any place of burial to be marked, which often gives rise to the discovery of previously unknown burial vaults and brick graves in churches during reordering programs. Conversely, a percentage of particularly large vaults have dedicated entrances off the churchyard, and as such cannot be missed, such as the Delisle Vault at Penshurst, Kent, and the Paulet Vault at Hinton St George in Somerset. Within churches, the locations of some vaults are distinctly marked, such as the numbered stones in front of the chancel steps at Thaden Mount, Essex, laid in 1611 and leading into the Smith vault. The steep staircase, which led onto a small corridor, was infilled, but the door leading off this corridor can still be seen through the vault's ventilation grille at the base of the exterior of the chancel east wall. A more usual access, encountered in many churches, is a slab with lifting rings, such as at Lydiard Tregooze in Wiltshire, affording access to the St. John vault, constructed in 1616. And when the 1674 Rayner vault at Thaxted, Essex, was extended in 1722, it was provided with a stairwell, a small ledgerstone indicating its place of access. But when it was further extended in 1741, the new stairwell was sealed by a reused 15th century slab, inscribed, "Beneath is the entrance into the vault," on the south side of this stone. The Hazelrig vault at Knowsley in Leicestershire is accessed via a steep staircase at the east end of the nave. And that of 1737, constructed by Smart Lethullier at Little Ilford, Essex, is merely capped off by a late 17th century headstone purloined from the churchyard. The simplest type of access can be seen at Ingatestone in Essex, where the 1571 Petrie vault is capped off by a blank ledger hard up against the wall, which was repeated in 1630 for the Maynard vault at Little Easton, Essex, and adopted later in 1811 for the Turner vault at South Creek in Norfolk. A better design is the churchyard approach to the 1656 Harvey vault at Hempstead in Essex, whilst the impressive Sackville vault at Witham, Sussex, remodelled in 1677, is entered via a reset 16th century door at its west end. Few adopted for the more obvious type of marker laid down by David Turner in 1811 in the churchyard at South Creek, Norfolk, which, with its legend, "The Mouth of the Vault," seems to be actively encouraging the curious to explore further. One of the more picturesque approaches is that to the 1814 Paulet vault at Hinton St. George, Somerset, whose porch resembles a mausoleum in its own right. But for those of you wanting a more Hammer horror state-of-the-art access, that of the 1865 Scott Chad vault at Thursford in Norfolk should suffice. A large slab within the church to the west of the south transept gives access to a short corridor, at the end of which is the vault. The large ventilation grille in its south wall affords a glimpse into the interior, with its tiers of sealed loculi, and the wooden door in its northwest corner still slightly ajar, with perhaps someone or maybe something about to approach. Intramural burials of the period 1650 to 1850 fall into one of 5 categories. The first is the large dynastic burial vault, either beneath a side chapel or aisle, more usually associated with noble families. Then comes the family vault, often little more than 8 feet square, usually associated with the landed gentry. The double-width brick grave with barreled roof tended to be associated with members of the professional classes, whereas the single-width brick grave, capped off by a ledgerstone, being a superior version of the earth grave and associated with those of the middling sort. And the 5th example are the extensive private and public vaults associated with town and city churches erected after 1700. Late 16th century burial vaults are rarely more than 15 feet square. And here a small aside, for as these vaults were constructed to imperial measurements, I shall be adhering to that system in this paper rather than metric. The majority of the earlier vaults were constructed of ashlar, brick, or a combination of both, often with a gently curving roof and with the walls invariably line-washed to amplify any natural daylight afforded by the ventilation shafts and that of the torchbearers at the time of subsequent deposits. The Eastern Paulet vault of 1575 at Hinton St George, Somerset, the image you're looking at now, is of that type. Furthermore, as none of these early vaults had either shelves or supportive brackets, the coffins were stacked on top of one another, the weight of the later deposits frequently crushing those beneath them and leading to stack slippage, as can be seen here. Indeed, so common was this sort of collapse that by the 17th century, we begin to see the introduction of shelves and loculi. The 1605 Cavendish vault at Derby Cathedral being the earliest known example of the type. Though this chamber is only 15 feet east to west and 12 feet north to south, it has an air of spaciousness. In 1810, Edward Stanley, 12th Earl of Derby, skillfully extended the vault, adopting a style similar to that of the earlier chamber. Equal in footprint to the 1605 Cavendish vault is the 1638 Culpeper vault at Hollingbourne in Kent. It's far less well appointed, almost provincial in fact. With no space for loculi, the coffins are simply laid on brick runners, serving as shallow charnel pits. In general, the attached mortuary chapels of the 17th century tend to be found to the north of the church, an area of the churchyard infrequently used for burial. The Harvey Chapel at Hempstead, Essex, is of this type, formed by blocking in the space between the east end of the the nave north aisle and the east wall of the chancel. The eastern half served as a schoolhouse, the western as a family pew, though there was a subterranean vault which extended beneath both chambers. Eliab Harvey was a wealthy London merchant who had purchased the Hempstead estate shortly after his marriage in the late 1640s. It's presumed that he built the vault in 1655, following the death of his eldest daughter, Mary. That the vault was in existence in 1657 is borne out on the inscription on Joshua Marshall's monument to William Harvey, surgeon in ordinary to Charles I, and author of the treatise on the circulation of blood, which records that he was deposited in his brother's new vault in that year. All told, there are 28 coffins in the 1656 vault and a further 16 in the 1766 extension beneath the chancel. Had both vaults been provided with loculi during the 1766 improvements, space could have been provided for a total of 140 coffins. Be that as it may, the vault contains a number of highly important anthropomorphic lead shells, with that of Mary Harvey, who died in 1657 at the age of 7 years, being particularly evocative. Hempstead is one of the more important amongst a rash of minor dynastic burial vaults of the mid-17th century. But, as I have said, without loculi, it can hardly be described as à la mode. The widowed Anna Knight, the heiress of James Craggs, Privy Councillor to George I, played it terribly safe in 1733 when she created her pew mausoleum at Gosfield in Essex, preferring to appropriate the western half of the 1560 Wentworth aisle rather than build anew. Excavations provided the burial vault, which, with its raised roof, allowed for an elevated pew from which she could both survey the chancel and the congregation. Behind her was a magnificent funerary monument with effigies of herself and her late husband, commissioned from John Michael Risebrough, with an inscription penned by Alexander Pope. Shortly after the death of her first husband, she married again, this time to the toy boy being shown, Robert Nugent, Viscount Clare, being 27 years her junior. Anna, Viscountess Nugent, died in 1756, and her husband some 32 years later. And both are now in the vault, together with John Knight, and also her first mother-in-law, Mrs. Knight. And for many years, there was a glazed mahogany case on the staircase containing a life-sized clothed wax effigy of Mrs. Knight Sr., facing eastwards, her hands on her lap. The effigy was last heard of in 1722 and may probably be in the burial vault itself. Some vaults, during the course of their history, have been remodeled to provide security for the earlier deposits and to make room for more. The Delaware Vault at Withyham in Sussex has been remodeled twice. First, in 1677, when the mortuary chapel was rebuilt following its destruction by lightning in 1663, and again in 1815 by John, 6th Earl Delaware. This was in part an archaeological exercise, as the double-depth shelf arrangement on the south side of the vault, that's the right-hand side that you're looking at, was installed to accept the then known contents of the vault, and the double-depth north range on the left for future deposits. And if you look carefully at the illustration, you'll see what I mean. The ranks of shelving on the south range are lower than those on the north. This was so as to accommodate the coffins already in the vault, whereas the rank on the opposite side is larger to accommodate all future coffins, whose sizes, of course, would not have been known at the time of the installation of the shelving. The mortuary tables in the center of the vault also date from 1815. Originally, they were end-on, with Delaware tradition being for the remains of the last Earl and Countess to take precedence within the vault until the arrival of their deceased successors, at which time their coffins were translated to one of the empty shelves. The coffin that you're looking at here is that of George Hebrand Sackville, 10th Earl Delaware, who died in 1988. What I would like to do now is to take you into rural Essex to study the burial vault of Richard Meuleman Trench Chiswell of Debden Park near Saffron Walden. In July 1772, the bachelor Richard Trench Chiswell of Debden Park, Essex, merchant of the City of London, Justice of the Peace, and Deputy Lieutenant for the County of Essex, died, and bequeathed his substantial estates to his 37-year-old nephew, Richard, the only child of his sister, Mary, the wife of Peter Meuleman of Kirby Hall, Great Yeldham, Essex. Peter Meuleman, who appears on the left of this triple portrait by his friend Thomas Gainsborough, was a Dutch merchant, a fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, and the author of a celebrated 3-volume history of the County of Essex. His son, Richard Meuleman, was a rather pompous individual, a landed proprietor with estates in Barbados and Member of Parliament for Albury, Yorkshire, who on receipt of his inheritance altered his surname by deed poll to Meuleman Trench Chiswell. Not content with Kirby Hall, he moved his wife and daughter from Great Yeldham to Debden Park, making it known that he was henceforth to be called Mr. Trench Chiswell, though his neighbours referred to him as the purse-proud Mr. Chiswell. It appears that Chiswell had long been planning how he was to spend his fortune, and straightway commissioned the building of a new Debden Hall from the architect Henry Holland. In 1782, he financed the encasing of the medieval parish church with an a la mode Gothic facade of flint with stone dressings to the designs of James Essex of Cambridge. He then rebuilt the clerestory, put up the steeple, and in 1786, he presented it with a fine codestone font designed by Richard Holland. It was in 1786 that Richard Holland was able to report to Trench Chiswell that the roof of the chancel had failed and required replacement. Exercising his license as Lord of the Manor, patron of the living and lay rector, Trench Chiswell took it upon himself to have the 14th century chancel demolished and to replace it with an octagonal family pew of white Suffolk brick in Strawberry Hill Gothic, designed by Richard Holland and John Carter. The specification included the construction of a spacious burial vault for the reception of Trench Chiswell's parents' remains, for those of his maternal uncle, and for those of himself and his family in the fullness of time. Internally, the floor level of the octagon is 6 feet higher than the nave, and from his grand armchair, which is still preserved in the family pew, Trench Chiswell could survey both the high altar and his tenants while seated in the nave. In actuality, this pew is little more than a late 18th century mausoleum abutting a late medieval church. Externally, the octagon is provided with codestone pinnacles and 3 huge heraldic roundels, also of codestone, displaying the grant of arms he had recently purchased from the College of Arms, instant ancestry of the most parvenu pomposity, which quite infuriated his armigerous neighbours. And against the south wall of the octagon, he had inserted a canopied tomb chest in the 14th century style, designed by John Carter. It cannot be denied that everything was in good taste, all that is, except for the individual placing of the commission. Everything done by Trench Chiswell complied with the comment made 150 years earlier by the antiquary John Weaver, that it was usual in ancient times, and so it is in these our days, for persons of especial rank and quality to make their own tombs and monuments in their lifetime, most especially because they thought to preserve their memories from oblivion. Before the works could begin, Trench Chiswell had to decide what to do with the remains of his maternal uncle and those of his maternal grandparents, who had brick graves in the medieval chancel. His maternal uncle, whose fortune he had inherited, was destined for the new vault, but he had no intention of putting those of his grandparents in there as well, so he moved them to a new brick grave in the southeast angle of the nave, erecting a monument above the Ledgerstone, which was also formerly in the chancel. It is assumed that the remains of his maternal uncle were placed temporarily in this brick grave until the new vault was ready to receive him. Originally, the Trench Chiswell vault was entered from within a railed enclosure on the north side. But since a small vestry was built on that site in the early 19th century, access is now via a trapdoor set into the vestry floor. The steps lead down to the western narthex, literally the area beneath the stub chancel, whose loculi were intended to serve as an overflow from the main vault and eventually given over to the coffins of the Vincents, into which family his daughter subsequently married, though these coffins were later translated to a larger family vault to the Vincents in Kensal Green Cemetery, London. The main funeral chamber beneath the pew is a square structure, 18 feet east to west, 18 feet north to south, as described in the confirmatory faculty issued on the 5th of March, 1793, roughly 5 years after construction had commenced. Angled across the roof in the southeast corner is a relieving arch in brick, distributing the weight of the octagonal pew above. And strictly speaking, the Trench Chiswell vault is not a vault per se, for its floor is only 2 feet below ground level. This may have been because Holland was relying on the extant foundations of the former medieval chancel on which to build the north, south, and east walls of the octagon, and explains why the south windows and the ventilation grills look out onto the churchyard. Holland's arrangement for the coffins in the eastern chamber replicates that in the western narthex, 2 tiers of brick loculi with the coffins addressed to the north, which is a somewhat unusual arrangement, as there was sufficient room for the loculi to have been placed against the east wall, the more traditional arrangement. It seems unlikely that this would have been Holland's ideal, and may well have more to do with his client's instructions. It's unfortunate that no documentation has survived which could assist us in understanding this departure from the norm. In reading from left to right, or to be more precise, from west to east, the top row contains the coffin of his uncle Richard Chiswell. The next is that of Trench Chiswell's wife Mary. Next to here, in the centre space, that's on your far right, is Trench Chiswell himself, a space he had designated for himself, judging from the small coatstone shield depicting his coat of arms. And the fourth loculi contains the coffin of his mother, that's on the left, and she had died in 1785, the coffin having been translated from her churchyard brick grave, and lastly, that of his father, who died in 1790. 1793 saw the completion and consecration of the octagonal pew, which included a fine east window by James Pearson, depicting in glorious technicolor Trench Chiswell's recent grant of arms. Flanking this are two monuments by the Society's sculptor Thomas King of Bath, one commemorating his parents, Peter and Mary Newlyman at Kirby Hall, Great Yeldham, and the other to his benefactor uncle, Richard Chiswell of Debden Park. And yet, how the mighty are fallen. On the 3rd of February, 1797, having paid Holland's bill for the new rectory, Richard Newlyman Trench Chiswell received the intelligence that his plantations in Barbados had been decimated by a hurricane, and fearing financial ruin and thus disgrace amongst his neighbours, he went into his study and shot himself, thus becoming an erstwhile early occupant of his own mausoleum. There are, of course, a goodly number of similarly large vaults in England of the same period. In 1795, Joseph Smith of Shortgrave Hall, Newport, constructed a vault beneath the northwest end of the chancel at St Mary's, Newport in Essex. This was for himself and his family. It's a large structure, 15 feet east to west, 7 foot 6 inches north to south, and with a height of 7 foot 6 inches, could accommodate a total of 40 coffins. The entrance is via a railed compound to the north of the chancel, beneath a huge slab marked vault. And yet it has only 4 occupants, being that of Joseph Smith himself, who died in 1822, his widow Margaret, who died in 1847, his son William, who died in 1885, and his son's widow Frances, who died in 1898. The vault remained sealed for 100 years until 1998, when there was a need to check its stability. It was indeed stable, and owing to its excellent ventilation, all 4 coffins were found to be in pristine condition, the polish still shiny, and the coffin furniture as bright as the day they were fixed. But Joseph's son had no children, thus a vault a 10th of the size would have been sufficient. And then there is the magnificent Bridport vault at Cricket St Thomas in Somerset, probably the more interesting of the 3, for this elegant chamber was constructed by and for Admiral Alexander Hood, Viscount Bridport, in 1820. His son Samuel married Charlotte Mary, the daughter and heiress of the Reverend Viscount William Nelson, Horatio Nelson's brother, whom on the death of her male cousin in 1835 became Duchess of Bronte in her own right. The coffin in the back row at the top, provided by the Crown Undertaker W. Banting of St James, is that of Mary Viscountess Bridport, Charlotte Nelson's daughter-in-law, who died in 1884. The one beneath, complete with its 3-dimensional coronet, contains the remains of Samuel, 2nd Baron Bridport, Charlotte's husband, who had died in 1868. Whilst that at the front, fashioned by the same cabinet maker who provided the coffin of her late husband, encases the body of Charlotte Mary Nelson, Dowager Viscountess Bridport and Duchess of Bronte, who died in 1873. She has 2 relief coronets on her coffin, being those of a Viscountess and those of a Duchess. All 3 coffins are in a remarkably fine state of preservation. In 1973, soliciting details from the archaeologist Brian Durham on the 18th century brick graves within All Saints, Oxford, he told me that no record had been kept, as he regarded them as nasty modern disturbances, which were to be removed as rapidly as possible to get down to the medieval and earlier structures of the church. Well, perhaps it is for the antiquary, persons like myself, rather than the architectural historian, to champion these structures and their sorrowful contents. Brian Durham's comment that there is nothing to be gained from examining post-Reformation burial vaults is far from the case. On the contrary, they have so much to tell us: funerary practices over the centuries, coffins and coffin furniture styles, and the differentials between the undertaking techniques provided for the gentry as opposed to that of the general populace. The Scouting movement motto is "Be prepared." So before you ask, the answer to your question is yes. Based on my knowledge of the history of the English funeral, my funeral mass has already been planned, and my coffin, as you can see here, has already been made, safely in store in Suffolk. I have secured a vault on Oxford Avenue in London's Kensal Green Cemetery, and the monument is up, merely waiting for the addition of the final date. Not to put too fine a point on it, be prepared, for you can't trust your relatives. And with that, I wish you a fond farewell.